Hey guys, we're in a pretty interesting time for PC building. Prices on GPUs have finally come down. AMD and Intel are actually competing against each other. AMD and Nvidia are also competing against each other. And with everything actually becoming affordable again, it's the perfect time to either upgrade or build a brand new PC. And with the next generation of GPUs finally being attainable by most gamers, I had to ask a question about my test system. Is the Ryzen 7 3700X good enough? This is not a question that came up during the 3060 review because most of the time that GPU was pinned at 100%, which means that the CPU is, yes, in fact, good enough. But that GPU did kind of disappoint me as its performance was very close to last generation. But now I have 6700 XT, which means I'm actually starting to experience some CPU bottlenecks. And I figured, why not now? When CPU prices are at their best, GPU prices are at their best, and motherboard prices are at their best that they've been in 2 years, to actually finally upgrade to Ryzen 3rd gen. But that then kind of makes a bit of a question. Is it worth it? Is this upgrade actually going to help? And more importantly, should you also upgrade? And if you're building a new PC and you're considering these parts, should you save the on average $100 that the 3700X provides, or save the $100 to buy the 5800X? And this is a more interesting question than you would think at first, because they use the exact same motherboards, they have the exact same RAM configurations, and they both can use the same GPU technologies. So is it worth saving that money or spending it? Today, we're gonna find out. But first, let me introduce you to our test system. I give you Mini Nova. This is a pretty awesome platform for us to test these processors. Why? Well, it's got an X570 motherboard that's been updated to the most recent BIOS, 32 gigabytes of DDR4 memory that runs at 3400 speed, and we'll test it, but it won't necessarily factor into the performance numbers, running it at 3600 speed, which is what it's rated for, but I have not been able to do it on the current processor. I also have plenty of gaming drives in here, which means that we'll be loading off of a SSD or an SSHD for most of our test. And I also have a brand new Radeon 6700 XT in this system. It's also not going to be limited by power because we have an 850 watt power supply. The whole thing is going to be housed inside the Lian Air Mini, a nice compact air-cooled case with a Noctua NH15 as our cooler. Overall, this case may be compact, but it will perform really well. And it would be an interesting way for us to actually check the processors to make sure that we're not going to be running into any thermal headroom issues. We shouldn't though, because, well, this cooler is incredible, and honestly, the current Ryzen processor that's in there doesn't even really stress it all that much. So let's start with the numbers that we got from the Ryzen 7 3700X. Let's actually start with a couple of synthetics. We're gonna start with one sort of productivity benchmark, Cinebench, because, well, it's completely free, and it lets us kind of see how this processor stacks up in comparison to more productivity focused processors. For Cinebench, we're looking at a score of 12,339, which is actually pretty impressive, putting it in complete contrast to most of the Intel CPUs that were released before the most recent generation. For our single core score though, we're getting a score of 1,281. This is actually sort of a bottleneck because some games unfortunately don't use that many cores, don't have multi-threading, and we're actually only gonna see that in one of our titles today, but it is the one that tips me off that there's probably a bit of a bottleneck in the system. We went ahead and did 3D Mark, and we're gonna use both the graphic and CPU scores to kind of talk about how things are affected down the line. For our graphics score on TimeSpy, we had a score of 12,698 with a CPU score of 9,738. Moving up to the extreme, our graphics score drops down to 5,879, and our CPU score drops to 4,570. For Firestrike, we actually ran both the regular, extreme, and ultra, which ended up showing us a very interesting result on the CPU. For graphics, it fluctuates quite a bit. 36,224, 17,339, 8,500, but the CPU score pretty much stays around 23,795. This is interesting because it's within a margin of error every time it runs, which makes me wonder if Firestrike's CPU test doesn't change, which is a little weird. For Unigen, we ran the Superposition Extreme, which is 7,026, and for Heaven, we ran again the Extreme, which gave us a 4,620. I don't understand how Unigen's Heaven benchmark is actually more intense than the other one. It might just be that the system is actually better at handling DX12 than I originally thought with the new GPU in it. For gaming, we went ahead and we tested 3 games, and these 3 games were actually picked because it's a best case scenario, a worst case scenario, and one that I actually found a problem. So those 3 games are Cyberpunk, Doom, and Phantasy Star Online 2. You knew that game was coming at some point, but there's a good reason this time. Cyberpunk 2077 is up first, and it is our worst case scenario because it is heavily bottlenecked. Unfortunately, this game runs at 50 frames per second on its maximum settings. We lower it to high, we can get to 60. We lower it to medium, we get to 80. We lower it to low, we get to 90. You'll notice not a single one of those is capable of going above 100 frames per second. This is also with ray tracing disabled. That being said, my best settings, and I think the ones that we're going to use for the most part throughout the rest of these tests, is going to be Cyberpunk Ultra with FSR, which gives us an impressive 75 frames per second for this game. So yeah, this one is definitely going to be hit hard, and it'd be interesting to see if upping the CPU maybe helps this game along. Doom Eternal is a game that can literally pump out frames like it's no tomorrow, and in this case, with Ultra Nightmare enabled, no ray tracing, we got 220 frames per second. Yes, this game just runs, and it runs well. PSO2 New Genesis was the one that I said I actually have a reason to believe that we have a CPU bottleneck, and that is because when benchmarking it, the game does not use 100% GPU utilization. More importantly though, it also doesn't use 100% CPU utilization. Yet, the frame rate doesn't change between FSR and Ultra. With Ultra enabled, the maximum preset, we're seeing anywhere between 75 to 80 frames per second. With FSR, we're seeing 80-ish frames per second, with dips into like the 70s, and it's roughly the same. Some areas will go as high as 90 frames per second, but those are like the desert areas with like low tessellations. It also seems that higher player densities do contribute to us having a lower frame rate. And since our CPU stays completely pinned at 30% utilization throughout the test, it makes me believe that this game most likely doesn't use all of our cores, and more importantly, is not running at its best efficiency. So this might be the one game where the actual frame rate goes up. Interestingly enough though, in our past tests, we were actually GPU bottlenecked, so this is gonna be interesting to see how much this GPU actually can perform in this title. As you can see, performance on this CPU isn't bad. It's actually very balanced in the grand scheme of things. So how much better is the next generation actually going to be with its IPC performance increase, its cache latency performance, and its ability to use higher speed memory? So let's grab this bad boy and actually put it in the computer. So let's go. All right, guys, benchmarking is all done. So let's get into the numbers. Okay, as before, we're gonna start with Cinebench. For For Cinebench, we got a 14,919, but that was actually without an overclock because, well, I forgot to turn it on. So we went ahead and reran it with the overclock since our other CPU was already overclocked as well. And that netted us a score of 15,117. For our single core test, we actually topped the charts, which is insane, with a 1,587. Now, I also did check to see if running at 3600 speed was possible now that we've upgraded the processor, and the answer is yes. And for that, we actually ended up with a 15,161, which is a marginal improvement, but then a lower single core score of 1,575. Because these are so close, I would actually say that this is within a margin of error, and that if we're going to see any benefit, it's going to be in the gaming benchmarks. For 3D Mark, we ran TimeSpy Extreme, and for those, we got a CPU score of 10,913 and 5,451. For our GPU score, we ended up with a 12,694 and a 5,911 respectively. Now, running those with the speed turned up on the RAM, we did see improvements on the CPU and GPU for regular TimeSpy, but albeit marginally, with an 11,130 and a GPU score of 12,708. TimeSpy Extreme saw a slightly lower GPU score, again within margin of error, and a slightly higher CPU score. So we saw a 5,492 and a 5,909. For Firestrike, we ran Firestrike Extreme, and Firestrike Ultimate. Our CPU score on Firestrike, pretty much the same behavior before with just margins of error in each category. It was around 29,901, roughly give or take a couple hundred points. The GPU did kind of fluctuate a bit. We went from 36,355, 17,465, all the way down to 4,148. Interestingly enough, we did see some improvement on the graphics score with the speed turned up in some of the tests. We saw within margin of error again, but Firestrike went up by a couple hundred points. Extreme went up by a couple hundred, or 100 points, just under 100 points. And interestingly enough, the Ultra results actually went up the greatest, going from just 4,000 to 8,000 points, over 8,000 points. That's actually pretty insane. For the Heaven Extreme benchmark, we got a 4,772, and with the RAM turned up to 4,776. Superposition, we got a 7,021, and a 7,045 with the RAM turned up. It does seem that the RAM affects things marginally, so we're gonna go ahead and leave it turned up for the gaming benchmarks because it does seem to help instead of hinder, which it should because Ryzen likes faster memory. The weirder thing is the fact that the RAM now works with the CPU. And I think it's probably more of a situation where, as mentioned prior in an overclocking video, RAM is technically overclocked when you overclock to those speeds. And while I think, I could be wrong, that the processor I was using was rated at those speeds, it was barely rated at those speeds. And the current generation of processors can go much higher. So I think this is just a situation where the RAM works, but it only works in specific situations. It also may have changed with the BIOS update. I did not check after updating the BIOS if the RAM could run at that correct speed. Now it does, so cool. Using this processor does actually have some effect on the system's overall compatibility and performance. For gaming, this is where things actually took a turn in a very interesting way, because all of our gaming results improved, every single one, even games that were pinned at 100%. Cyberpunk 2077 Ultra with FSR actually got 80 frames per second, which is 5 frames per second over the original run. And the variants were very unusual because before 75 was kind of like where it was averaging out, but this time we were seeing dips into the 90s and with our lows being like 79. It's kind of interesting to see that just having an increase in memory speed and just processing power can actually give you an extra 5 frames there. Doom Eternal, again, we saw an interesting result. We saw 230 frames per second, meaning again, we gained frames. And at times the game was running at 260 frames per second, Ultra Nightmare 1440p. That's incredible. PSO2 New Genesis was the one that I said was probably the most bottlenecked, and I was correct. We went all the way up to 100 frames per second. Yeah, honestly, I was shocked to see this game running so well. So that then brings us back to the question, should you upgrade your Ryzen 7 3700X? And I find myself in a weird situation where I say, probably not. Yes, we did see improvement. And yes, Phantasy Star Online is a perfect example of a game that ran better with the new processor. But the hassle of actually replacing a processor, changing everything out, and actually redoing everything is a lot more than I think it's worth. Remember, this processor generally goes for $400 on Amazon. Right now, it's on sale for around $338, which is what I ended up paying, which is very close to the Ryzen 7 3700X on Newegg, which again means that if you had an option between these two, you would want to go with the Ryzen 5 or Ryzen 7 5800X. But in this case in particular, we're not really seeing that much improvement from that upgrade. We're not seeing it as like a, you definitely should upgrade, because if you're not, you're going to lose out on a lot. Instead, what we're seeing is that you can get slightly better performance. That being said, the fact that we top Cinebench's scores for single-threaded does mean a lot for some older games. And in some cases where we are CPU limited, again, probably in older titles, we will see a better frame rate. Things like CSGO probably benefit greatly from having this processor. So if you're playing esportsy titles with settings turned down to low so that you get higher frame rates, that is when you should really consider using an upgraded Ryzen processor. Not to mention, we have a brand new Ryzen generation starting very soon. And from what I've heard, we're gonna see a much bigger IPC improvement than what we've already seen with the current Ryzen line, making it so that, again, AMD and Intel are fighting for the best possible gaming processor. Granted, that would be a much more expensive upgrade because you are gonna be upgrading motherboard, RAM, and processor. So realistically, if you're in a situation where you're wanting to upgrade to kind of stretch the life out of your system, maybe consider it. All right, that's where we're gonna end today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I actually had a lot of fun making this video. And if you wanna see more like this, seriously consider subscribing. Maybe checking out in the description. I have merch and stuff. Like, I don't really push it too hard, you know, not like lttstore.com. But we're gonna be coming out with some new designs coming up soon that are gonna be pretty cool, so. And I will see you in the next video. Wolfie, out.